Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Greetings of peace upon you. Najah, Hajja Najah, it is absolutely wonderful to have you with us here today in Lead Integrity's conversation series on integral leadership and the integrity of leadership in today's times. I will introduce you in a minute. For now, I just want to make sure to remind our listeners about the purpose of Lead Integrity and the purpose of this podcast series. Lead Integrity is the first women of faith founded and led global consultancy, management consultancy, with expertise from men and women from around the world, all of whom are inspired by their respective faith traditions, not only one faith tradition, not only a few, any faith tradition, and who are professionals in the full sense of the word, with a minimum of 25 years of service, public service in every domain of human activity and service to the common good. Our roster encompasses these amazing professionals, and the commitment that each of those who come together in the space of what I like to call the space of wisdom, the circles of wisdom, is effectively public service, is a service towards the common good. We believe that being inspired by our respective faith traditions is in and of itself a value added to the way that we see the world and the way that we seek to serve. So this is the purpose of Lead Integrity. The podcast series is to shine some light on the wise women and men who are doing some of this remarkable public service. All the more reason, Najah, to be able to welcome and celebrate you, agreeing to make the time in your extraordinarily busy schedule to be with us here today for a conversation which tells us your story, your thoughts, your wisdoms, as you care to share them. So let me now introduce you. I've had the great pleasure of an extended conversation with you in which I felt overwhelmed by everything that I was learning and seeing. So let me now introduce you so that people can understand that which is extremely important and insightful and a blessing to us all. We have an opportunity to learn from a very rare person who is Najah Bazzy, a district nurse and the founder and CEO of Zaman International. Hajja Najah, as those who work with her love to refer to her, is an internationally recognized healer, humanitarian, and interfaith leader who actually left a six-figure salary as a critical care nurse to build Zaman International. This Metro Detroit nonprofit empowers marginalized women and children to break the cycle of poverty. She was recognized as one of the top 6 Muslim female thought leaders by Global Women magazine in 2022 and as a 2019 top 10 CNN hero. Both recognitions highlighted Zaman's growth from a grassroots team of volunteers to a world-class organization that has helped 2.87 million people in 20 countries since 2010. Najah was highlighted as a Best of TEDx Detroit awardee in 2022 and one of Crane's Detroit Business 100 Most Influential Women in 2021. In 2020, she was also recognized in People magazine's Women Changing the World issue and featured in a number of distinguished media outlets. She was also inducted into the Michigan Women's Hall of Fame. She and her family appeared in the PBS film Muhammad, Legacy of a Prophet, which was viewed by over 15 million people when it premiered in the United States and has since been seen by hundreds of millions worldwide. Born and raised in Southeast Michigan, Najah earned her nursing degree from Madonna University, and she holds a Doctor of Humanities honoris causa degree from Oakland University. Over the past 3 decades, she has specialized in critical care and transcultural nursing. The CEO of Diversity Specialists, Najah has implemented a national model of transcultural clinical care and hosted workshops for healthcare institutions across the United States. She has also served as an adjunct professor at Michigan State University Institute of International Health and currently teaches graduate courses at Bayan Claremont Theological School in affiliation with the Chicago Theological Seminary. Lest you think that that is all, a gentle reminder that in 1997, she co-founded the Young Muslim Association, now known as the Muslim Youth Connection, and serves as a senior advisor, providing leadership training to youth, which remains an issue very close to her heart. Najah Bazzy, it is an honor and a privilege to have you with us here today. I'm looking forward to others to hearing your story.
Thank you so very much. It's my honor and pleasure. And thank you for that introduction. It's always embarrassing listening to all of that.
I think it's only women who suffer that embarrassment, by the way, whenever their bios are being read out. We tend to sort of quake inside and hope it's going to pass over quickly. Whereas generally, I've noticed that with some other people, there's usually don't I just love this being introduced kind of thing. But no, women who serve and who lead through service actually do not seem to appreciate it. It doesn't matter where they come from or what religion they are or what domain of service, generally don't appreciate the big, huge hullabaloo, but you so fully deserve it. And I do want people to know who you are and the background and the opportunity, the remarkable opportunity you're offering us.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Najah, tell us a little bit about your upbringing, the kinds of things that motivated you to be the woman that you are today.
Well, Assalamu alaikum and Bismillah, in the name of God, most gracious, most merciful. I think, we never come to it on our own, right? So I suppose we could say part of it is genetics, but part of it, I think, is learned experience. I come from a family of matriarchs. My grandmother was a matriarch in Syria, in her village. She was the village doctor, the village counselor. She was the village midwife. She was way ahead of her time. Everyone sought her counsel and trusted her. And she was also very famous. She was a chef before the title was given. So that sense of hospitality was really powerful. And then my mom was born here in the United States because Dr. Asa, one of the things that I think is so remarkable, I think I would never have done it, is that the grandmothers would, they would be married. The grandfathers would be here in the United States working during the Industrial Revolution. The grandmothers would come by boat, military boat, because their husbands were citizens. And they would make this long journey from whatever lands. And this is the typical story of many immigrant families, not just Arab and Muslim families.
Well, just forgive me for interrupting you. When you spoke about your grandmother in the village, which village?
In Homs. My grandmother is from Homs, Syria, which has been pounded, pretty much, decimated. And also from an incredible valley called Alahat al-Husn, which houses this beautiful, huge, massive, the third largest castle in the world. And her family were the caretakers of that castle. And that sits right outside of Homs. So as their story goes, the grandmothers would get on the ship and come to the United States. They would deliver their children here, stay a couple of years, take the children back home, raise them there, and then the children would return for the most part when they were teenagers, especially the boys, as part of, economic stability for their families. And that's also the story of my father. I'm born here. Family's been here 135 years. And that's a long, long, long time. So we are on fifth generation. My grandchildren, I have 6, are fifth generation now. So if you ask, kind of what the story is, I think it's being raised during that kind of hub of immigration near the Rouge plant, which is the first industrial plant that rolled off the Model Ts. And I grew up in a very, very diverse neighborhood. Dearborn is the city, and today Dearborn is known as the largest concentration of Arab Americans in the United States in a concentrated area. But back then, it was a hub of immigration. So you grew up with, Macedonians and Italians and Polish and German and Mexican, different faith traditions, and everybody just lived together and watched over each other's children. And so I would say the diversity that I learned kind of came from that upbringing. I think the school teachers that I had, who were all white American, had a tremendous love for this little Dearborn village. They cared deeply about the children whose parents couldn't speak English. And they basically raised us. And I'm a product of not just an incredible loving home, but an incredible school system with teachers who to this day I'm still in touch with and have influenced my life dramatically. They believed in me and they put me on a pathway that was pretty special. The other thing that I think contributed is that we lived outside just the border of Detroit, and I'm a child of the 60s. So I'm a child of the music industry and Motown juxtaposed against classical R&B music and the race riots. And 1967 race riots are very vivid in my mind. And I think that also really set me on a path of social justice. But perhaps the most important thing of all, and the most influential piece of growing up, is my brother Sam. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala rest his soul. He died last year at almost 70 years old. He was the longest living person with muscular dystrophy of his kind, which means he never moved a day in his life. Never. He never moved anything. And so we all, our siblings, we all cared for Sammy. And his name is Samir. And we did everything for him. But we watched a man who could not walk move the world. And for me, that meant that if I could walk, there was no choice but to move the world.
Wow, that's profound. Do you want to just share a little bit more about Sam moving the world and how that impacted on you? Give us an example, or just share a little bit more of that particular story, please.
Well, as time moves on, let's say Sammy's probably now maybe close to 55, 60. When he graduated college, he and I went to college together. We'd get him, we did everything for him, everything from itching his ear to brushing his teeth to getting him dressed to fixing his hair. And in the end, he was still, he grew up. He was a teenager. He wanted to go to prom. His brain was brilliant. It's just his body could not move, could not do anything for himself. So one of the things that happened when he was in his 50s is Stephen Hawkins actually came up with the technology, or someone came up with the technology for Stephen Hawkins, because he had that massive stroke. And this technology would allow people who would have these differently abled, bodies to be able to use the pupil of their eye to move a cursor. So I was working at the time, and Sam said to me, Najah, that's my family name. Najah, I want this technology and I really need it because I'm unable to move. He did have this of his ability to move. SubhanAllah, I just his little bit of finger. And that was gone. So he said, if I could get this technology, I'll be able to, live, communicate. So of course we purchased that technology for him. And in purchasing that, Sam was able to communicate with the world through the movement of his eyeballs. which meant he could order everything online that he needed. He could DoorDash. He could send us messages, text messages. He could live on Facebook. He could golf online. He can order my mom and dad's medications. And he, of all my siblings, I would say was perhaps the most responsible one and the most helpful one. And so Sam's ability to figure things out, to adjust to a world that pretty much dismisses people like him, that's a very powerful thing that lives within me. And the fact that, his icon was a smiley face, that just still to this date amazes me, that someone who had all of these difficulties could still smile through the world, and his lens was one of hope and one of happiness. That checks you every single day.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's a powerful story. Thank you for sharing that with us. So as per your bio, you were working with a six-figure salary. Can you tell us a little bit what kind of work you did and ultimately what moved you to leave that and to found Zaman, and maybe also then tell us the story of Zaman and what you do with it?
Yeah, but I can't guarantee you that I'm not going to cry through it, because every time I tell the story, I choke up, no matter how many times I've told the story. And I think it's literally been hundreds of times. But
I believe very strongly that emotion is a form of intelligence, perhaps the deepest and highest form of intelligence. So you show emotion, you are more than welcome to do so, because this is about wisdom. So please.
Well, then that would put me in probably the highest level of emotional intelligence, because I do cry quite a bit. And anyone that knows me knows that I cry like it's just a snap and I'm crying. So basically what happened, I'm a critical care nurse by background. I wanted to be a physician. Desperately wanted to be a physician. And I had the clinical brain to be a physician. But Arab women at that time did not become physicians. They pretty much got married. Meaning in our neighborhood, not worldwide. And that was just the family tradition, which I wasn't about to fall into that. So, I battled for med school, but Detroit at the time wasn't the safest place. And quite honestly, women were not getting admitted into med school like they are now. It was rare for women to be in medical school. In fact, the year that I wanted to apply, there were 2 women who were applying and the rest were all men, which I thought was a huge injustice. Made me want to apply even more. But regardless, I ended up in a nursing program because my parents wouldn't agree to allow me to go to med school. So this honorary doctorate degree that I have means the world to me, because it's actually a degree in medicine. And I love medicine. I wanted to be an open heart surgeon. That was my thing. I love the heart. My father was a medic in the Army, and I used to play with his United States Army. So I used to play with his surgical utensils all of the time. And I really, really gravitate to the heart just naturally. And I suppose my role in this world might be to help fix hearts, heal them maybe. And perhaps that's why I gravitated to open heart surgery. Nonetheless, I ended up in the intensive care unit for surgical open heart surgery. And that kind of started a long career in transcultural clinical medicine. The reason why is because I would see people coming in to the hospital critically ill, some of whom were my family growing up, and things just didn't work right. And I was working at a Jewish hospital, Sinai Grace Hospital. And, the Jews had everything in place for Jewish caregiving, which I really admired. And I thought that is so beautiful. There was nothing in place for Muslims or for other faith traditions, unless, of course, you were at a Christian or a Catholic hospital. And I thought to myself, this is just why? Why are we so far behind? And so I decided to study transcultural nursing, got degreed in that. That allows you to work between populations, between belief systems, and help. The way I designed it was to help patients from birth to death, enter a healthcare system and allow the healthcare system to work within their belief system, meaning the patient's belief system. So it's kind of like Patch Adams. It was kind of like that work. I had a patient who wanted to be baptized, and he was on a ventilator and on his deathbed basically, and hadn't been baptized. So I'd arrange for his baptism, or a Jehovah's Witness that needed bloodless surgery, and so I'd advocate for the policy for that, or Muslims who couldn't be removed from a ventilator for their own religious beliefs and practices. So that was the work, and it also led to a lifetime work in medical ethics. So that all brings us to this moment in time where I was called for a consult, even though I was working full time, but I would still get called to consult on these critical ethical issues. And this was an Iraqi family. They had lost over 13 members of their family during the Gulf War. The family came as immigrants. The mother delivered twins. The first twin died. The second twin was alive, and that was the twin I was called to consult on. The infant was 3 months old now, had lived its entire life in the neonatal intensive care unit. And the doctors decided that the baby's life needed to be terminated because of futility. That's the word we use in medicine. And futility means that there's nothing more, like medical care is futile. So they took the case to the ethics team that I sat on. The ethics team did not allow me to be involved because they thought that I might be biased, which is problematic.
Yeah,
people think that we can't think independent. And that was a little upsetting, and they voted futility, which means the courts would have supported that decision in the state of Michigan to remove the ventilator. So I got involved. I have to tell you, if I ever felt the divine presence, it was in this case. Because what ended up happening in the model that I teach, you learn 3 solutions. You learn how to accommodate, how to negotiate, and how to repattern. These are the things that I teach physicians and nurses and healthcare systems. And I brought the model into Zaman as well. It's a way that we think. So I thought, well, let's see what can accommodate, negotiate, or repattern. So I ended up getting the baby home on a ventilator with some hospice support, which really doesn't exist. And it was just the grace of God. I went to visit the family and found nothing in their home whatsoever. And this home was maybe, it's what we call in Dearborn the East End, so more economically, stable than where I grew up. And I thought that they were moving in because there was nothing in the house whatsoever. And, I've got my white lab coat on, my stethoscope, that power of position, and the family was so grateful that they could bring their baby home. So gracious. Grace beyond something that I can't quite describe it in words. So I asked them I wanted to see the little bottle of tube feeding because the baby had a tube feeding for his nutrition. And they took me into the kitchen, which was bare. There was a white styrofoam cooler, like the kind you get from the gas station. They had ice in it and this little teeny tiny bottle of formula. And I noticed that they had a propane stove, a 2-burner propane stove, like the kind you take to the picnic park. And that's dangerous in the house. And, they had some pots and pans, but I started to think to myself in the moment, like when I tell the story, I actually see myself in the kitchen, turning the corner, thinking to myself, what's going on here? They must be moving in. Can I see the baby? The baby I found in a laundry basket. They had taken like 6 or 7 clean towels, white towels. I remember that distinctly, and they had tags on them. So that's how I knew they were new and clean. And the baby was just lying there on these towels. And, I thought to myself, oh my God, what is this family crazy? What are they doing? And then after a couple minutes of speaking with the family, I realized that they built a crib for the baby. And their other children had nothing. They had nothing. And it started to, your brain is rapidly firing. And I realized that this family has nothing. So I said goodbye, told them I would be supporting them as the baby dies. We knew the baby was going to die within, any moment to hours, max maybe 3 days. I had already raised the funds to bury the baby. And I left. I got to like the steps of the front porch, got into my silver Dodge Caravan van, and I just busted into tears. I couldn't take it. I really cried so hard. Called my mom, bawling. I'm like, Mom, you will not believe what I saw. Mama was moving, and Mama's like the big fat Greek wedding. She has like three of everything, three refrigerators, three stoves, everything. My mom is a true humanitarian. My parents didn't have anything, but Dr. Hazard, they were the truest of humanitarians. Like my dad wouldn't leave a restaurant unless the busboy was tipped as well as the waitress. Just salt of the earth people. And Mama said, Najah, yalla, come on. Take whatever you want for this family. I have everything. And so I rented a U-Haul, and me and my 4 children, we went to Mama's. And then as I was telling Mom the story, my mom didn't stop giving everything from silverware to towels to mattresses to refrigerator, stove, furniture. We outfitted the whole house in 2 days. Day 3, the baby died. So I started thinking to myself, who else is in this situation? What I learned is that people have a lot of dignity, and those who ask the least need the most, and those who ask the most need the least. This is what this work has taught me. So after that case, I just started asking around, and little by little, the word started to spread, and I would take from Peter to pay Paul, and who has a refrigerator and who has a stove. And we did that for 15 years out of the back of my Dodge Caravan, and 3 engines later before we had an office. And that's just what we did, very grassroots. And that led to, food boxes and food drives and coat drives and toy drives and this person's, basement and this school's gym and this church's space and this mosque's place. And it just started growing over the years. By 2004, so this was 96, by 2004, Dad had dementia. My sister got cancer, and I'm like, I can't do this anymore. We need to move toward a nonprofit. So that was one of the stories. But I also had, and that story has many, many components, many tear-jerking stories attached to it that we wouldn't have time to talk about, but I hope to write about. And we began. And the other thing we were doing was also burying babies, because I found over 200 babies that were stored in jars and tubs in 2002 from 1997. And it was that same feeling. I'm like, not on my watch. And that kind of just became how I felt. I'm like, not on my watch. This isn't going to happen on my watch. We got to do something about it. So we mobilized, and Zaman was born. And here we are going into 30 years in 2026.
Wow. That's quite the story. When you and I were talking earlier, you mentioned, and you brought up some of this now in terms of the transcultural approach. Can you maybe tell us a little bit more about that, especially in relation to what you consider to be the distinct value added of the way that Zaman serves? Is there a link between the transcultural work that you hold so dear to your heart and the work that Zaman does that renders it perhaps somewhat different? It doesn't have to be different, by the way. There's so much humanitarian need out there that it's not about what makes us different, but it's about how we can serve better together. But tell me a little bit about whether first of all, the transcultural approaches that you've had and have used and still continue to enlighten about, and in what ways they potentially relate to some of Zaman's stories, the stories of Zaman.
That's a brilliant question. You can tell that you're such a professor because that's an excellent question because they do relate completely.
Mm.
So the transcultural model, it's called the Sunrise Model. It was created by Dr. Madeline Leininger, who was the first nurse anthropologist. Basically, she was working in third world countries and doing anthropological work on how to care, how to cross culture, how to provide care to people who were different than we are here. And so she designed what's called the culture care theory and the model. It's called that Sunrise Model. So the Sunrise Model kind of allows you to look at all aspects of what we would be looking at in healthcare. Like, for example, what are people's folk practices? What are their life ways, beliefs, and practices? What are their technological factors? What are the educational factors? What are the political legal factors? I fell in love with the work, and the work for me was very easy to understand, but she didn't have it in a clinical way. It was more for like villages in New Guinea and other places. So I decided, well, you know what? We're in Detroit and we don't have to travel the world to use this model. People from all around the world are in our beds here and as patients. So I wanted to use it as a clinical model and see how it would work. It worked really well. And it was outstanding work. And I realized that by using the model and training in it and testing it, that I was able to unlock deep issues that others were not able to unlock.
Can you give an example, please, Najah?
There's so many examples. I have a favorite story, though.
Please.
It's a little bit long, but it just illustrates the best way. And I usually use this story. There was a 17-year-old girl who delivered in the hospital from Yemen. And this is post 9/11. And I was on call 24/7. It was one of the negotiating chips I used to be my own boss and be able to have my own freedom and not have to clock in and clock out and all that sort of thing. So I get a phone call as I'm leaving to pick the kids up from school. And this is what I hear on the other end of the phone when I respond to my pager. Najah, yes. You need to come upstairs. We have a problem. I'm like, okay, I'm rushing out being the Arab mom that I am, want to pick the kids up on time from Montessori, all of that. Hear my mom in my head, Najah, you're late for your kids, you're late for your kids. So I said to her, well, what's the problem? Well, we don't know because she doesn't speak English. And I'm like, oh my God, another one of these very judgmental issues I'm going to deal with. So I grudgingly go upstairs, take the elevator, and I go into the room. And I see this beautiful mom. She's holding her baby. She's smiling, very reserved, very quiet. Immediately when you walk into the room of a patient, the vibe, you can tell nothing is wrong here. So I say to the nurse and the social worker, what's going on? They're like, well, she's taking the milk, the colostrum out of her breast, and she's rubbing it on the baby's face, just like that. And I'm like, well, did you ask her why? No, she doesn't speak English. That's your job.
Oh, lovely.
And I'm thinking to myself, is this all just post 9/11 stuff? What is this? Why the attitude? Where's the compassion? So when I visit her, go back into the room, I say to her, this is who I am. This is what I do. Mabruk on the baby. I say, the blessings, ask her if I can hold the baby. One of the things in like leadership I've learned is that humility requires that, and integrity requires that you ask people to teach you what you don't know. And so it's the way that I do things. I said to her, teach me what you're doing with the baby. I understand you're taking the milk out of your breast and you're rubbing it on the baby girl's face. She smiled gently and she's like, yes. She's like, in Yemen, if you take, in Arabic, she said it, but translates to golden milk. If you take the golden milk and you rub it on the baby girl's face, she'll never wrinkle when she grows. She will not age. I thought, wow. So using the model, I'm going to accommodate that practice. Am I going to negotiate with her anything? No, because she's not doing anything that would harm herself or her baby. But where do I need to repattern? The team. So as I went back out, I said to them, well, I think I'm going to be bottling colostrum and probably buying it at the Chanel counter for $100 an ounce. Because what I just learned is that when you rub the colostrum on the baby's face, you don't age.
Anti-aging, right then and there.
Right. And I mean, that's what colostrum is. And so I said to them, but I need to understand, what were you thinking? They're like, well, we can't check the bonding box on her assessment. So we were going to call protective services because we didn't understand what's going on. Dr. Haza, when you call protective services on a family in a hospital, I mean, that's like a really severe situation. And I just looked at them. And then in an instant, I realized that there was something more behind this. I said to them, you know, what's really bothering you? And the social worker said, well, she's 17 and having a baby. I said, well, here in the United States, our tax dollars, yours and mine, spent a lot of money on teenage pregnancy. The fact that she's married in a supportive family is something that we should be very proud of, because many are not.
No, that's true.
And I said to them, you know, the idea that you're going to call protective services and put the hospital in jeopardy and break up a family, that's not the way this should have been thought of. But I knew it was laden with a lot of innuendos, prejudices, post 9/11, people that didn't look the way that we may want them to look, or smell the way we may want them to smell, or act the way we may want. And that particular case never leaves me because of the fallout that could have happened. There's so many cases like that, but it made me even more determined to teach and to train and to open up, have people see their hearts, because many people think they have good hearts, but then if you are able to get them to turn inside out and see their views, they may realize that they have very dark hearts, not very bright hearts. And Islam, for me, leads with bright heart, not a dark heart. There's room for everyone in Islam. And that drives me. It drives my leadership. And so how it ties to Zaman, I took the model because it's what I knew, and I built the organization based on the model, and we still use it today. Our decision-making is, should we accommodate, negotiate, repattern? What are we doing here? And the directors all know the language, and it's part of how we solve.
When you talk about repatterning, in the story that you shared, you immediately understood that it would not necessarily be repatterning of the young teenage mother and her baby, but repatterning of the team that you are working with. And I wondered, is that always the kind of decision that you need to make, who and where to repattern? Because generally, as humans, we tend to think that we've got it all, we know it all, especially in these big industries, medical, educational, etc. We live in the Western Hemisphere, we know it all. So the repatterning, if and when it happens, consciously or unconsciously, is often assumed to be something you do over there. It's not something that you may need to do yourself. There's no self-reflexivity in this process. It's really about how amazing you need to do, how much work you need to do over there. And in the world of, also to some extent, of multi-religious interfaith, etc., it's always assumed that since you've put things together and we're here together and we're all committed to one another from different faith traditions, we must be okay. The work that needs to happen, the repatterning, if you will, needs to happen over there, outside of us. Have you had to deal with any of those, for lack of a better word, any of those prejudices, this assumption that we already are doing things well, but the work that needs to happen elsewhere, outside of the space of us? Have you encountered that in your work generally and in Zaman in particular?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, for us, it's a daily exercise to reflect inward and repattern ourselves as a leadership practice, because the tendency is to repattern the other. But really, in order to be effective, you have to check yourself all the time. It's what they call now implicit bias, right? But it happens just all of the time. There's so many examples because this work is like daily life. It could be anything from the way you serve your clients to the way you treat your employees, the way they may treat the client, the way things just manifest. So it's an active, not a passive. It's a very active way of thought and way of living, and always looking inward and seeing, what could I do better? What am I missing here? Where's this coming from? Right? And so that happens, I think, more frequently than the example I gave you, which is to repattern the outside. So I would say, like, for example, post 9/11, we had to do a lot of repatterning of people who really wanted to know, for example, about Islam, and who had very sincere questions and really just wanted good information. And you find yourself behind a microphone or in dialogue, and you realize that people often are coming from the sincerest places but have just really bad information. And oftentimes the bad information they were given were from Muslims themselves, who perhaps see Islam in these cultural contexts and not in its purest context, right? And so, and I would take that and say to myself, I have to repattern myself. I have to have grace. I can't assume people are going to know what I know. They haven't had my lived experience. When people ask me about arranged marriage, with the assumption, well, was your marriage arranged? I'd say, yes, of course it was arranged. I arranged it. I met him, at the drinking fountain in 7th grade. I mean, things like that. I had to learn to really understand those nuances, and that people overall in general mean good and not harm. But I do have a strong problem, a strong issue with the way we culturally impose and sometimes even colonize thought of the other here in the West. But I've learned that people do that all around the world.
That is
people think that they're right about everything.
Right. An example of how we colonize thought. Can you share something that you've been thinking about or that you've encountered? Because I think I understand what you mean. I hope I do, but give me an example of what you were.
I'll give you a simple example in medicine at the end of life, because 40 years I've been doing end of life work. Oftentimes we hear this, oh, they're suffering, we need to end their suffering. And suffering for one person is not suffering for another person. It depends on the context you're coming from. So let's say, for example, we have a person coming from Gaza or Lebanon right now, or Syria, and they arrive at the United States. What we perceive as suffering or difficult might be a walk in the park for them compared to what they've suffered, right? So suffering is one of those big things that here in Western thought, we colonize the thought that this is what suffering means. And from an Islamic perspective, it may not be that way. Even culture may not. And it's different between people. And so you always have to ask that teach me word, right? So I hope that example makes sense. But like in hospice, I'm often teaching, don't be so quick to use that word, well, we have to give more morphine because they're suffering, or, we don't want them to suffer. That issue of suffering is very, very different. A lot of my Catholic colleagues also have the same issue with the idea of suffering because it's understood differently. And so it's just these nuances that I've learned, but also we want people to do things our way here, especially in healthcare. Another example is, why doesn't that mom just get up? Why is, her mother next to her babying her that way? She needs to just get up.
Interesting.
Whereas, you have to explain, well, you know what, in their particular culture, a mom is a mom forever. There's no such thing like her mom's job is to baby her this way. It's not that the mother's being lazy or doesn't want to care for her baby. This is the way, the maternal bond works. Grandmothers are second moms. They're a mom forever. And there's like no detachment, whether she's 18 or 80, she's still a mom.
Mm-hmm.
So I have to give examples of how my mom is in her 90s, but she's still our boss. She's still in charge of all of us. She's mom. So these just kind of different things about the way we live our culture and the way we think other people should live their culture, live out their life. And it's different because we oftentimes think that we have the best answers, which isn't always true. But I think there's a shift here in the United States and in Western countries, learning from people who have these deep cultural traditions. Like, for example, the Eastern religions have had a powerful influence on us here in the United States now, whereas before, it wasn't like that. So I think we're becoming more open, but I think that landscape also changes based on certain very important things.
So given what you shared, it's interesting that you say that you feel that the landscape is opened and there's more learning about other religions, other cultures. And yet it seems from the context of the world we live in right now, especially here, but not only, that there may well be wanting to go back to certain dominant patterns of white Christian ways of being and thinking what this country is supposed to be originally built on. It wasn't originally built on all these others coming from around the world now. In fact, we're not necessarily that comfortable with all these others coming from around the world, even though some of them have the same religions that, the original folks came here with. There's so much othering taking place globally, everywhere in the world, but especially I think you see it in more heterogeneous, diverse cultures. You see the othering more clearly because that's what you do in heterogeneous cultures, you other. How do you feel about, like, on the one hand, you said things are getting better, there's more openness. On the other hand, we're sensing politically, socially, more retrenchment to certain imagined supreme values and ways of thinking and ways of being faithful. How do you see those two things?
That's an interesting question. What I've learned over all the years, around the world, working in other communities, in the hospitals, I would have to say that when the drums of fear are sounded, we automatically, our mammalian instinct goes back to, survival mode and survival of the fittest and fight or flight. And I think that's a very strategic, well-studied instinct that is an instrument to cause feelings of superiority, feelings of self-righteousness. But my hope is in the younger generations that, the world is certainly a village. It's not what it was when I was growing up. It's not isolated anymore. And the fact that younger people have the world in a different way is where my hope is. That doesn't mean that well-established institutions cannot use that fear and influence. That they certainly do. There's no doubt we're seeing that. But ultimately, I think that the younger generations will push back on it. It's not the world they want. And they're not going to have it. They're going to push back. And so that thought, the sounding of the fear drums, the immigrants are going to get you, or you're not safe, or you're the wrong color, or any of these deeply rooted institutional racisms, I don't think that they will last. They will peak and they will die down. And in that I have hope, because I love America. I'm born and raised here. This is my country. My family's been here 5 generations deep. And I think that this country has the capacity to be able to swell with diversity and then shrink with fear, and then swell with diversity again and shrink with fear. But in the end, ultimately, this is a country that was founded on immigrants who fled Europe in hopes of a better chance and of religious freedom. And that can never be forgotten. And it must always be sourced, and it must always be reminded. And so in that, I think there's a lot of teaching opportunities. And my hope is that, we will continue to be a nation of one, as was intended. And I aspire to those goals.
Given, this is beautifully said, and given what you mentioned about the young ones, what do you feel that your own learning, some of the wisdom that you have now that was actually taught, because you mentioned this very important word, teach me, in the very beginning of your story. When you've asked that to some of the young people around you and the ones that perhaps you engage with, can you share, in addition to the fact that they won't take the shrinking with fear, can you share something else that you feel you've learned from them, from some of them, and what we should be doing as professionals in different walks of life, from different walks of life? What should we do to be better able to walk alongside the younger generation today?
I feel very strongly that we have to respect them. And that we need to listen to them. And I don't say that lightly. I've had a youth group for over 25 years, and generation after generation after generation, and hundreds and hundreds of young people that I've mentored. And I'm always delighted in the way they think. And I think there is a synergy between the wisdoms of people of my generation and the energies of their generation, and not getting stuck. And I feel like, as we grow older and we grow wiser, we know what works, but we had to learn the hard way, and it's okay for people to fall down and pick themselves up and fall down and pick themselves up. And that's part of life's journey.
Mm.
But young people, to me at least, I want to invest my time in them. I always say Zaman is the right thing to do, but the youth group is my soul's work.
Mm.
Because by investing in them, I feel like I'm seeding the next generation of young Muslims. And when I put my head down in the grave, there's always going to be somebody that's going to feed people and house people and do what Zaman does. There will always be those people because, humanitarianism is something that's almost innate to us. We just got to unlock it a little bit more. But there isn't always someone that's going to listen to the difficulties of young people.
Mm.
And I think it's just critically important to understand their world and to not make them of our world, but to make ourselves more of their world.
Okay, and I promise this is the last one. We are in troubled times where so many differences, as you said, we're perhaps shrinking. This is a time when our world globally seems to be shrinking with fear as opposed to swelling with the diversity and its strengths. And here in the United States, we've gone through we are living in very polarized times. As a fifth generation American Muslim woman of Syrian origin,
And Lebanese.
and Lebanese,
That is Lebanese.
um, fantastic. What is the one, and if you were given the opportunity to put a pearl inside the heart of everyone who's listening and many who will listen in the future, what would you want that pearl of wisdom to be? What is your pearl of wisdom?
My pearl of wisdom is hope. And I've learned this from those who were dying and leaving the earth. And I'm really big. This is my ethos. This is my thing is hope. Because what I've learned is when there is not hope, first of all, I believe, this is my belief system. I've come to believe that hope is something intrinsic. It's built in, it's placed there by God. And hope allows us to get through everything and anything. And it allows us to be resilient and to challenge, and it gets us through illness and death and war and hunger. When the hope is taken away or the hope is diminished, then our human brains and our existence actually moves into a very deep, dark place. And that's where we see people troubled and suicide and anger and hate and war and all of these things. I've learned that you cannot define anyone's hope.
Mm.
And that is something that can only be defined by every individual. And I've also learned that when it's dark, if you can, and I'm not saying this to be like philosophically silly or philosophically light, I've lived this and I know it's true. When you are able to provide just a teeny bit of a light, just a little bit of light, then that brain chemistry changes and the soul changes, and that person can then begin to open their hope and open their world and hang on to something. But without that hope, it's a very difficult world and life to manage.
Just to nuance, you said, as you started, you said, this is my belief system. And then you elaborated on the hope. Is there a connection between what you believe and this very passionate conviction you have about hope? Is there a connection? What is it? Because you can't assume that everybody understands what that connection is. What is the connection between what you believe, your belief system, as you put it, and your understanding and passionate advocacy for hope?
I think it's more than one thing. I think it's a life lived watching people leave. And when you're ministering to the dying, it's a very different experience than ministering to the living. The dying teaches you a lot. And what you learn from them when you ask them, like, what is your hope in the moment?
Mm.
You know, and you hear what comes out of their mouths. It's so powerful that it's just very centering.
Mm.
And I've learned that that's how I've learned about hope, that it could be hope for whatever. Let me just say, it could be hope for reconciliation. It can be hope for a breath. It could be hope for no pain. It could be hope for, a hug. It could be, it's so big and so deep.
Mm.
And I've just learned because I've been taught by those who I will never speak to again, who will never have a moment again unless they've left a book or whatever, something, some teaching behind that. There's so much wisdom in this. Like hope is a practical thing that we all feel, we all share, we all understand, we all act upon, we all get medicated for when it's not there. We understand it. And that is the one human value or whatever that we have in common that I think we can all link to. How it's affected me the most is one person's hope cannot step on the other person's hope.
Mm.
And that's what we have in war right now.
Mm.
And because if one person's hope is dominance at the expense of another person's hope for survival, that's a problem. And so hope it has its own life, but it has to also be measured and tempered, and it has to be equitable. But that's the world that I work for, is a world that's more equitable. Everyone has the right to eat. Everyone has the right to education. Everyone has the right to a life of decency, of dignity, of integrity. God made them all.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea that one people is more righteous or better than another people doesn't land itself with the institution of hope that I believe in.
I love it. The institution of hope. And that's one institution we don't have as yet. We got plenty institutions doing almost everything under the sun, but the institution of hope we don't have. And perhaps that's the thing that we each build, as you said, in our own ways in service. But it's never going to be something that you draw up a legal set of documents and bylaws and things for. Or is it? Is it something that we need to, institutionalize in the traditional sense of the word?
I don't know, the hope doctrine. When we named the man, I called it Hope for Humanity because that's how much I believe in that ethos.
Well, there's one thing that's for sure. You give plenty hope. Your entire career and service and orientation is that of giving hope. And I love the fact that you phrased it as learning from living a life, watching others leave life. It's a profound implication that we don't necessarily understand or appreciate in our daily critically busy lives. We don't understand what it means and what wisdom is distilled from being alongside those who are in their saying their farewells, so to speak, to life itself. So that is a profound learning, and I want to thank you so very, very much. I think there's everything you've said is not just food for thought, but is the very atoms of thought itself. It gives us a lot to learn from and reflect on for a lifetime. So thank you very, very much.
I appreciate you, and I hope that this organization continues to swell.
It is, thank you. we are ever enlightened by the spaces of wisdom and the wisdom itself. And we're indebted to those like you who have so much to share and so little time actually to share it, but you make the time to share, which is something that, so again, not to be philosophical, but it's something that is in and of itself a means of giving hope. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Bazzy. Thank you for having me. I appreciate you.
Pleasure. And we look forward to continuing to learn from you. And we wish you the best for Zaman, for the work with youth, for the accompaniment that you provide to so many in these very amazing times. Many,
Thank
many.
you so very much.
Hajja Najah, what gives you hope?
So I think what gives me hope is Islam, uh, because it's so big and vast and encompasses. There's room for everyone in Islam and God's justice. Those things, they give me hope, and I find myself unlimited in this beautiful faith.